Good afternoon and welcome. I am Michael Waldman. I am the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and we are so glad you're able to join us for this vital conversation on an urgent topic that we care about and that consumes so much of our thinking at this moment of challenge for the country. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We seek to reform and renew and defend the systems of democracy and justice in our country. The way we see it, we work to hold our political institutions accountable to core aspirations and ideals of democracy and equal justice for all. And what a moment, what a time to be having those conversations. I do want to make clear that for all of us, as this is an election year, an election month, we want to make very clear that we are a nonpartisan 501c3 organization and do not participate in electoral campaigns or endorse or oppose candidates. And that is true for this event as well. We're having this conversation, of course, at a particularly fraught moment on the issues we will be discussing. The country finds itself in the midst of a painful and long overdue reckoning with systemic racism and with its consequences for millions of Americans through our criminal justice system. This has been brought to light and brought to the surface again so strikingly and distressingly in the last few days. As we at the Brennan Center have said, whatever one thinks, Breonna Taylor, in our view, deserves justice. And this indictment for wanton endangerment is not that. It is one more piece of evidence, as if more is needed, that our criminal justice system needs urgent and fundamental reform from top to bottom. And of course, this conversation comes after months of focus on this, as we have not had in years, in the aftermath of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and too many others. Americans of all political views, of all creeds, of all colors and racial backgrounds are focusing on what we can do better and what we can do differently. What kinds of changes are needed? What kinds of deep and real changes? Not to policing, of course, but not just to policing, but to the policies, the overall system that fuels mass incarceration and exacerbates economic inequality, and that links those two things together. The Brennan Center has just published a study, which we'll be hearing about in this conversation, that found that these systems reinforce. Our analysis shows that people who have spent time in prison see their subsequent annual earnings reduced by an average of 52% over a lifetime loss of nearly $500,000. And a key driver, given the racial disparities in our criminal justice system, of the indefensible wealth gap between
Hi, I'm Laura Arnold. I'm the co-founder of Arnold Ventures. Our mission at AV is to maximize opportunity and minimize injustice. That mission has led us to take part in a range of investments, including education, healthcare, public finance, democracy, and of course, criminal justice. I say of course because I can think of no greater impediment to opportunity and justice in this country than our criminal justice system. Those of us who've worked in criminal justice for years, and I know there are lots of you here today, have known this to be true for decades and decades. And now, given the myriad tragic events of the last year, the entire world can see it. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rashad Brooks, Daniel Prude. Sadly, that's just a partial list of the killings that we witnessed this spring. And over 1,000 people have died in jails and prisons from COVID-19. The world is bearing witness to the deep structural problems in the American criminal justice system. It's demanding the kinds of changes many of you have spent years advancing. The Brennan Center has been a key partner in this work. Its incisive analyses highlight critical issues and provide roadmaps for true reform. The Brennan Center led the charge on understanding the drivers of our declining crime rate. It analyzed the reasons people were sent to prison and provided a blueprint for safely cutting the prison population. It recently published an analysis of the steep costs of fines and fees and their toxic effects on our system of justice. The report released today is yet another sobering reminder of the work that lies ahead. It tackles an often overlooked issue in the fight to end mass incarceration. It examines the devastating economic impact of incarceration on our most underserved communities. I'm thrilled to be with you today to introduce a discussion on a topic that is so critical to our pursuit of justice and opportunity. And I want to thank the Brennan Center for allowing me to set the stage for your distinguished panel. I'm going to start by laying two truths on the table, and then I want to talk to you about where I think we can go from here. Here's the first truth. We live in an era of excessive punishment. Over the past half century, incarceration rates in the United States have increased fourfold. 2.2 million people behind bars, 4.5 million people on probation or parole. Pretrial detention rates increased 433% between 1970 and 2015. Half of all Americans report they have an immediate family member who is or has been incarcerated. What this means is that even though crime rates have dropped to historic lows, the criminal justice system continues to reach deeply into American life, to an extent never before seen in our country's history. Make no mistake, we chose to be here. We've chosen to be the most punitive among Western democracies. And no one has borne the brunt of punishment more than Black and brown communities. Black and brown people, especially Black and brown men, are so disproportionately represented in every part of the criminal justice system that it's impossible to look at the numbers and not recognize systemic racism. And Brennan's latest report demonstrates that the harms to these communities don't end with incarceration. In some respects, the harm begins there. The financial harms of mass incarceration pervade Black and brown communities. They perpetuate economic inequality. Incarceration results in lost wages, immense financial burdens on families, and bleak employment prospects. And the costs to taxpayers are inordinate. Mass incarceration is a poverty maker and a poverty trap. In a vicious cycle, low-income people are more likely to enter the criminal justice system, and the system in turn diminishes their earnings. Every step of the way, excessive punishment exacerbates poverty. Through money bail, through fines and an assortment of fees for everything from filing paperwork to securing representation, even if you're indigent. Through predatory pricing inside prisons for everything from phone calls to commissary items. And of course, through lost earnings. Most of us would agree that this excessively punitive approach doesn't make us safer. Which leads me to the second truth I want to share with you today. Here it is. We know enough, more than enough, to demand and enact change. There will always be open questions, and we can always support more research, which Arnold Ventures is proud to do. We'll continue to invest in deepening our understanding of the drivers of criminal justice dysfunction and the effectiveness of solutions. But we're living in a transformative historical moment of renewed racial reckoning amid a public health crisis that most acutely impacts Black and Latino communities, and on the cusp of a critical election season. Here's what we can do. We can seize the opportunity to acknowledge America's 400-year history of racial injustice that continues to produce profound inequalities. We can start conversations like this one. We can take research and data to our legislators and to the public. And we can initiate transformative change that dramatically reduces the number of people trapped in our correctional system. Now is the time to end our era of punitive excess. I want to take a moment to commend the Brennan Center for launching an essay series on this topic. Two of today's speakers are playing key roles. Eisen will lead the effort, and Bruce Western, along with my colleague Jeremy Travis, will help shape the series and contribute essays. We should acknowledge what Bruce Western has termed the punitive revolution in American criminal justice, which has had the effect of making our incarceration levels and responses to crime feel normal, when in reality they're extreme and depart from historical and international standards. We need to reassert that the purpose of the criminal justice system should be to provide effective responses to crime, promote community safety and well-being, and give everyone a fair shot at justice. The system should not perpetuate and exacerbate poverty. It must not perpetuate racism. It must respect and value human dignity. We have an opportunity to set a new agenda for the country, end mass incarceration, reduce the footprint of the justice system, transform community supervision, eliminate cash bail, eliminate the fees that feed the justice system, reduce the use of arrests, reform the police, remove barriers to employment for people with criminal records, and end the legacy of racism in the justice system. This latest Brennan Center report is a challenge to our conscience, a rallying cry to those who care about racial justice, the elimination of poverty, and the creation of strong, economically viable communities. We at Arnold Ventures are proud to be your partner. So thank you, Brennan Center, for the important work that you do, and thank all of you for being a part of the solution. Enjoy this panel today.
Hi, I'm Susan Shira, Editor-in-Chief of the Marshall Project. I'd like to explain that Michael Waldman lost his internet, but thank you for your opening words. And now to discuss the future of the criminal justice system and reforms, we have a uniquely qualified panel. Rashad Robinson is the president of Color of Change, a leading online racial justice organization.
It's good to be with you, Susan.
Thanks, Rashad. Topeka Sam is the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries. She's also co-founder of Hope House NYC, a safe housing space for women and girls. And I'm proud to say Topeka is a member of the Marshall Project Board of Directors. Welcome, Topeka.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see everyone here.
Bruce Western is the Bryce Professor of Sociology and Social Justice and co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia University. He's the author of Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison, and Punishment and Inequality in America. Hi, Bruce. Okay, we're going to move to Lauren-Brooke Eisen, who is the director of the Justice Program at the Brennan Center. She's the author of Inside Private Prisons, An American Dilemma in the Age of Mass Incarceration.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today.
I'd like to invite those of you who may be watching on Facebook and YouTube to share questions in the comments for the panel. We're going to take as many questions as we can during this program. We'd really like to hear from you. Please do think of what you'd like to ask our distinguished panelists. Let me start off our conversation by directing a question to LB. At the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit journalism website devoted to criminal justice, for those of you who don't know us, we expose failures and examine solutions for a criminal justice system that, as Laura told us, is in crisis. And I know that the Brennan Center's Justice Program seeks to expose these hidden costs of incarceration, from the billions of dollars in fines and fees levied against those entering the criminal justice system to the profound social and economic hardships encountered by those who leave it. The Brennan Center just released the report that Laura alluded to, finding that conviction and imprisonment affect more people in more serious ways than was previously realized. And we know at the Marshall Project this has filled an important gap in our knowledge. Can you tell us a little bit more, LB, about the findings of the report?
Absolutely. And I just want to thank all the panelists for joining us today for this important conversation. And as many of you know, at the Brennan Center, our justice program focuses on reducing our reliance on incarceration. And we seek to educate policymakers and the broader public on the devastating and lifetime consequences that even mere contact with the criminal justice system can bring. The report that our team released last week examines not only how imprisonment, but mere contact with the criminal justice system impacts future economic prospects. Specifically, the ability to earn a living wage over a lifetime, and how this contributes to systemic issues of economic inequality. My colleagues who co-authored this report, Terry Ann Craigie, Ames Garrett, and Cameron Kimball, issued this remarkable report, which finds that, as Michael Waldman said earlier in this conversation, people who have been to prison face around a 50% reduction in annual earnings, and that adds up to nearly $500,000 over the course of their lifetime. Even conviction of a misdemeanor, such as shoplifting, can reduce earnings by 16%. The report also illustrates how the reduction in earnings persists over a lifetime, deepening poverty, specifically for Black and Latino people. While white people who have a prison record see their earnings trend upwards, formerly imprisoned Black and Latino people experience a relative flat earnings trajectory. And for people with a similar socioeconomic status, the average white person with a criminal conviction will still earn more than a Black person without a criminal conviction. These findings demonstrate that ending mass incarceration is not only an economic imperative, it is also a moral one. We're at this inflection point in our country, and we know that our criminal justice system isn't working. We know it has failed our communities. We know that our criminal justice system reflects the broader systemic racism of our society. If we are serious about addressing intergenerational poverty, if we're serious about addressing our 400-year history of racial injustice, we have got to overhaul our criminal legal system. It's what transformational change requires. We know enough about how our justice system has failed our communities. It is time to translate this research into action.
Thanks, LB. Rashad, last year at the Marshall Project, we actually published a story called The Hidden Cost of Incarceration that examined the enormous financial burdens that incarcerated people face when behind bars. And we realized at that time the incredible gaps in data on how much prisoners' families pay to support their loved ones while they're incarcerated. So we set out to talk to those who are affected by it. The Brennan Center's new report, as LB just said, noted that white people who have a prison record still see their earning trends upward, while formerly imprisoned Black and Latino people either have flat or see drastic reductions in earnings. Should this really surprise us? Why does this happen, and what can we do as a country to really provide equal opportunity in your view, Rashad?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that this report, which is immensely helpful, the work of the Marshall Project, which is immensely helpful, is one part of understanding the cost of racism. What is the economic cost of racism in education and how that plays out over a lifetime? What is the cost of racism in healthcare? And how does that play out over a lifetime? People don't experience issues and families don't experience issues. We experience life. And the forces that hold us back are always deeply interrelated. And so the ways in which the criminal justice sort of engages us is all part of an incentive structure connected to media, connected to politics, connected to corporate power. It's not just that sort of Black people are in a deficit and it's a shame and we should have pity and charity. The money goes somewhere. And I think it's really important that we sort of lean into this idea that the money goes somewhere so that we're not simply talking about Black people in brown communities in the sort of active voice and talking about the systems in a passive voice. It's not that Black folks are losing money. It's that Black folks and Black communities are having money stolen from us. Black people should have a right to earn and pass on to the next generation. That money goes somewhere else, and it goes to other people. It's given to rich people through tax breaks. It goes to corporations who extract it in 1,000 ways. And so if we understand that, then we recognize that we're not simply in a research or hearts and minds game if we want to change this. We are in a conversation around political power. Because it's not simply about convincing people that it's the right thing to do to sort of undo these barriers. We actually have to force those changes because in some way, there will be people in institutions who have been profiting off of the incarceration of Black and brown people that will have to lose resources. And at every turn in our fight to actually undo these challenges, there will be folks standing in the way because of how they benefit, because of how this situation, which, as Laura Arnold said in her opening, is a choice. These decisions that we are sort of living with are a choice. Inequality is manufactured. And so in order for us to get to real change, we have to recognize that because it's been manufactured, we have to tell stories that are not just unfortunate, but tell stories about the injustice so that we don't end up with charitable solutions to structural problems. More reentry programs to help people sort of deal with structural barriers that at the end of the day are not going to allow them to have the same opportunities as white folks. Recognizing that it can't simply be about fixing Black and brown people, but have to be about fixing the systems, the structures, and the institutions which benefit from our pain and which profit from inequality.
Thanks a lot, Rashad. I'm going to turn to Topeka now. Obviously, when we meet as a board at the Marshall Project, we all benefit from your hard-earned personal insight into the justice system. Your organization provides support for marginalized women and girls. Can you help talk a little bit about the lived experience of people who have been convicted of a serious crime or spent time in prison? You know, Rashad was just talking about, and Bruce has written about, the difficulty when you re-enter society. What does life look for these folks? And talk a little about gender, because this is, as we know, the rate of women who are incarcerated has increased, even as men are still incarcerated more often. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on that, Topeka.
Sure, absolutely. First, I want to thank all of the esteemed panelists for their insight so far. And just wanting to share a little bit from what I've heard so far. You know, when we think about women specifically, and we think about what's happening in this country right now, we think about the injustices. You know, I can't help but just talk about Breonna Taylor, right? The fact that as a woman and how she's been treated. When I think about Sandra Bland and what happened to her, and how these cases are happening not only to women who actually die at the hands of violence, violence took from the police, violence from the community, but also when you think about the violence that women face when they're incarcerated, being sentenced to life in prison. And so often we are forgotten. And when I think about my experience and the things that I went through, it was the same things that we've heard today, you know, the systemic racism. And as we think about how do we change these systems, we have to start there. We have to start with acknowledging the wrongs that have been done and changing those wrongs. And how do we change them? In our opinion, in the work that we do at the Ladies of Hope Ministries, is we cannot change incarceration by ending it unless we reinvest money and dollars into communities and give opportunities. Stop criminalizing poverty, substance misuse, mental health issues, and things that, one, women face at a disproportionate rate than men, but two, that people of color face disproportionately versus any other community. And so the solutions that, you know, we've been doing are understanding, one, you have to invest in the people who understand the problem, like myself, our organizations, those that are led. Rashad talked about reentry programs that actually work. But on top of that, it's how are we actually investing in these foundations, these reentry programs, right? I know we've talked about, and I've mentioned even with you, Susan, before that, you know, we can't look at saying that we're going to do charity work, right? And we're giving, small amounts. We're giving less opportunities. We are, continuing to lock doors, keep barriers up without presenting new opportunities, funding for people to do the work. What happens is organizations are being invested in at very, very small nuggets, right? So for example, our work and the things that we do it's direct service. And while we need policy change in order to change all the things that are happening right now in this country, disproportionately again toward women and girls, that we have to make sure that while we're ending incarceration, while we're changing conditions of confinement, while we're looking at things as a whole, that we have to make sure that we're investing dollars back into the community, into organizations that work around affordable housing, around trauma-informed care, and around resources. It threw me for a loop when I heard about the fact that incarcerated, I think what LB said was that the people who have been incarcerated, white men who've been incarcerated, are more likely to be hired and make more money than a Black person who has never been incarcerated. And then when you think about women, the fact that we are resource-less, the fact that we have less opportunities, the fact that when we get jobs, we're paid less, but then you think about women who have been incarcerated or have families impacted incarcerated, we're not even thought about. And so the opportunities that we have to build and create for ourselves, we're then also expected to create these incredible changes without the proper resources in order to do them. And so what I'm seeing within the communities, not only in New York and New Orleans where we are and expanding, but in all of the communities across the country, is that poverty is what is being criminalized. Women are having terrible times right now, losing their jobs because of the pandemic, not being able to be employed because of criminal conviction. Children not having safe places to go because of school, and then foster care and that other system is coming in, taking the children away because they don't have the proper resources, like tablets, like internet in order to do school. So then it's caused an ACS case. And I can continue to ramble on about all these different systems and why we talk about these systemic issues, but they are all interconnected.
Right.
Cannot keep looking at the systems as separate to reform them. We need to create new opportunities and pathways in order to transform the lives of people in the community and in our country.
Thank you so much, Topeka. This is a great segue to Bruce, because Bruce is an expert on reentry, and Topeka was explaining that how important that is. You served as vice chair of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Causes and Consequences of High Rates of Incarceration, and your book was a study of what happened in Boston with a whole group of people whom you followed as they reentered society. With all that we know about the harms of mass incarceration, it's also been really interesting to us at the Marshall Project trying to get a sense of, even in the midst of the pandemic, where it's actually a matter of life and death for a significant segment of people who are behind bars, we have not seen, with a few exceptions in a few, say, states or localities, any kind of significant decarceration or release. Why is that, and what do you think lies behind that?
Yeah, that's a really urgent question, Susan. And I got to say, it's great to be in this conversation with Topeka and Rashad and LB. And we can think about your question in two ways. One is like in the really specific context of the pandemic, and a public health crisis just exploded in American prisons and jails, and people were getting sick, people were dying, and yet the conditions inside could not be alleviated by depopulation, by getting people out. Now, prison and jail populations have gone down during the period of the pandemic, but that's not chiefly due to people being released for medical reasons. Our courts slowed down. Entire cities have been locked down with the pandemic, and it's largely those sorts of things that have taken the pressure off prison and jail admissions. It's been really hard to change policy and say there is a crisis happening in these facilities and people need to be released in order to be kept safe. So that's kind of one answer in the specific context of the pandemic. But then, if we look at the last 10 years or so, even though there's been so much criminal justice reform activity around the country, and Topeka and Rashad have been leaders in this effort, and the Brennan Center has been a leader, the reductions in incarceration have been relatively small, and they've focused on things. I don't want to call them the low-hanging fruit because they've been really difficult to do. Changes in drug policy, bail reform, diversion from the front end of the system, from jail chiefly. The really hard question goes to violence and how we respond to harm and interpersonal violence in our communities. And I think that has been one of the real obstacles to taking a big bite out of mass incarceration and responding in a medically serious way to the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I think the point you make about violence is something we wrestle with a great deal at the Marshall Project, in the sense that I think it's a much easier sell to the public, of course, to say, okay, this person was, convicted of a drug crime, say. But how we deal with people who are convicted of violent crimes will indeed be crucial, I think, in the days ahead. Let me turn back to LB. I know that the Justice Program at the Brennan Center also offers policy recommendations, something the Marshall Project doesn't specifically do. Obviously, we're on the verge of a presidential election, and we have, a president who has pointed to the First Step Act as a tangible criminal justice reform, which applies to the federal system, not the states, of course. But should there be a different administration, what do you have in terms of specific policy recommendations about mass incarceration?
Absolutely. And, I think, most people who are tuning in today know that whenever we speak about the federal government's role in mass incarceration, we must acknowledge that more than 90% of the people who are behind bars in the United States are in local jails and state prisons. So while the federal government can certainly play a role in reducing our reliance on incarceration, a lot of the work has been done for decades at the local level, the state level, and that's going to need to continue. But to answer your question, there is work that the federal government can do, specifically, although it won't fix policing, and we have so much work to do in this country when it comes to police violence. And I just really want to reiterate, this is not a sort of one-size-fits-all solution for policing in this country, but I should acknowledge that the federal government does have a role to play in terms of federal oversight. And that comes from robust statutory authority that the Justice Department has to open what are called pattern or practice investigations. And what those pattern or practice investigations do is they focus on systemic behavior as opposed to specific incidents. And the Obama administration actually oversaw more than 20 investigations into potential abuse of police power, culminating in consent decrees across the country. And I do want to point out, that the current administration has only begun one pattern or practice investigation, and the Justice Department can really do so much more and needs to in terms of opening these pattern or practice investigations that have and can produce systemic changes to law enforcement agencies by addressing racial bias and attempting to reform use of force policies. And another area where the federal government has a tremendous ability to make change is through federal funding. And at the Brennan Center, this is something that we have been focused on for many years. When we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about the 2.2 million people behind bars, when we talk about the 4.5 million people who are on probation or parole right now, so this is more than 7 million people under some sort of correctional supervision in this country, we can't forget about the role of federal funding. And we often talk about the enormous increase in criminal laws and the increases in lengths of stay and truth in sentencing and mandatory minimum laws and provisions that really resulted in more people being incarcerated for longer periods of time. But the federal funding also played a significant role in this. And since the 1960s, the federal government has really shaped our criminal justice responses, how law enforcement has been the really sort of first responder to so many situations where we know law enforcement is not equipped to be that first responder. And since the 1960s, we've seen the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, and then the 94 Crime Bill. And these are federal funding streams that tremendously increased federal funding for law enforcement. And we know with the 1994 Crime Bill that some of the funding went to states who increased their what's called truth in sentencing laws, so that people serve longer periods of time behind bars. So what we need to do in terms of federal funding is work with Congress to ensure that federal dollars are sent to states to reduce incarceration. And that's something that the Brennan Center has been doing for many years. We've got to reorient our federal funding priorities to prioritize solutions that don't involve a law enforcement response. We've got to send dollars to communities that we've divested from for hundreds of years.
Thanks so much, LB. I want to turn to Rashad for a moment. Color of Change has been a remarkable force in mobilization, using social media, using grassroots organizing, as well as 21st century advocacy strategies. You've put a lot of boots on the ground in terms of change. What I want to ask you is, we're at a fascinating moment. We saw these larger scale protests really recorded this late spring, early summer after the killing of George Floyd. We've also seen in recent weeks a slight dip in polling support for Black Lives Matter, which had shown remarkable surges in support. How sustainable do you think the kind of widespread, I think what happened was, because of video, a lot of people who might have never really confronted what was going on and what was experienced daily by Black and brown people in this country actually saw it live, and it changed minds. Is this sustainable? Do you think the passion about this is ebbing? And if it is, I'm curious about what strategies you at Color of Change are thinking about.
I think it's a really complicated question, and there probably can be like multiple books or articles written about it, because I think that there's a lot there to your question, and I think we shouldn't come draw any quick sort of theories based off of what's happening right now. I mean, what's the uprisings that we saw over the summer, right, are a direct result of 10 years of organizing, of movement building, and particularly 7 years of Black Lives Matter, from Trayvon to Sandra Bland to Michael Brown, and these moments, and leadership being built, infrastructure being built, demands being sort of created in such a way where more could be educated. And then we were also in a moment where an unprecedented number of eyes were looking at screens at the height of COVID, where people were home and paying attention in ways, and just looking just at the sort of open rates and action rates, just from a data perspective, were very different than they are even now. And so, we have to take all of that into context in terms of where people were at. Black liberation, Black freedom, justice for Black people never polls well. It's never been widely popular. And even at the height of some of the moments that we look back on where huge change, policy change, rule change was able to happen, we could look at the sort of corresponding polling and maybe be shocked by it today, or folks who maybe don't pay as close attention could be shocked by it today. The fact of the matter is that Black Lives Matter polls well above folks who are on stamps and have buildings named after them during the height of their era. And so, I think where we're really at is, once again, recognizing that polling doesn't win public policy change. If polling won public policy change, we would have sensible gun reform in this country, but we don't, because power wins on these things. A school of white children could get shot up and no meaningful change happens. And so I do think that we have to situate ourselves in terms of what we're trying to win. And then from a grassroots organizing strategy, that is why we have to actually focus on the sort of strategic levers that will actually drive change. And so for us at Color of Change, we are very much focused on the barriers to change. And so if you look at the gun analogy, you can't make change on these sort of issues without dealing with the NRA. And to the policing and criminal justice, we have to deal with the district attorney associations, which stand in the way of progress, the Fraternal Order of Police, which stand in the way of progress, judges and others that don't want their sort of histories relooked into, small towns and communities which rely on prison labor and prison populations and the taxes that come from that opportunity to be able to fuel their economy. What we have created in this situation is so many institutions, communities, and people that rely on the locking up of Black and brown bodies to survive and to live. And so public polling alone will not get us to victory. We have to build power. And so that is why we are focused on driving energy at the right strategic levers to make change, and not as worried about what does it mean if we lose some people here or lose some people there, with a deep recognition that when we win, there will be a whole lot of people that will say that they were on our side and marching with us, chanting our chants and singing our songs. Mm-hmm. And so part of this is actually winning. And that requires us to have a very clear focus on the barriers that stand in the way, be willing to pressure and put and hold account those who say they are our friends, those who say Black Lives Matter, but actually don't do anything about it, and dealing with the larger narrative space. So we're not simply telling stories, but we're building power around the ideas that will be transformative.
Thanks so much, Rashad. A quick question for Topeka. We're going to start taking some questions from the audience soon, but Topeka, Rashad is talking about structural change and power. You also try to think about changing the culture and the understanding of the lived experiences of those who have been incarcerated and are trying to return to society. What do you think are the levers that you have found useful to drive change in your work?
I mean, just to echo what Rashad said, it's the same. You know, people with the lived experience, sharing their lived experience to be able to inform policy and recommendations that need to happen is critical. That's why you see at any time, at any stage in this country, when things change, it was because the people that were most impacted were the ones who were speaking about the things that needed to change. And yes, while I've noticed, we do have a huge movement right now, thank God, where people are wanting to come together, whether it is bipartisan, whether it is, not race-based, gender-based, because there's a clear understanding of what's happening in this country. And to everyone's point, as a Black woman, I know what has happened and what happens and has been happening from the day I was born. What I would like to see is that, opposed to just elevating the stories and people having to consistently relive their trauma, that we're actually, again, pouring into more opportunities, resources, unlocking and changing these barriers that are happening, giving people the same opportunities that they had, whether or not there was a conviction, truly looking at what violence and what does violence mean in this country, and looking at guilt versus innocence. We have all these different siloed movements, whether a person is convicted, wrongfully convicted, or a person is a nonviolent versus has a violent a crime, and opposed to us just looking at the reason why all of these things happen through trauma, through violence, through sexual abuse and trauma and violence, through substance misuse, through mental health issues, through systemic issues, through poverty, through all of these things that happen in the community. We can all categorize and define violence as different things, right? And so how do we change that? We change that by really, again, making sure that we're getting opportunities, getting resources, changing language around campaigning and voting, right? Voting is critical, whether we're looking at local or, our federal elections coming up. But for those people who are still disenfranchised, remember there are many people who still have the right to vote who either can't get to the polls. Let's get them there. Let's make sure that people understand they can do absentee ballots. Let's make sure that people who can vote, who have not been convicted, can vote right now. Right now, it is about voting and getting people who understand the needs to represent us in our communities.
Thank you so much, Topeka. I'm going to ask Bruce a kind of combination question, one that I had in mind and one that's been raised by the audience. So they kind of go together. But let me start with the specific one first. We know that people behind bars, have been incredibly vulnerable to COVID-19. At the Marshall Project, we have a weekly tracker that updates every week the rising toll, and the curve has not flattened behind bars. It's very important to point that out. And it's uniquely challenging to contain and mitigate COVID-19 in correctional facilities. Do you have any thoughts about what people can do, policymakers or correctional officials, in order to try to bend the curve behind bars?
Yeah. I've been working on this over the last couple of months, Susan, with a National Academy of Sciences consensus panel on COVID in prisons and jails. And, there's guidance offered about social distancing and PPE and quarantining and cohorting and so on. And a lot of that is going on in prisons and jails around the country now. There are two studies that have been really important, I think. And one shows that in a large urban jail that managed to significantly decarcerate, to release people, the transmission of the virus, this reproduction rate, declined very, very significantly. And they got a handle on the virus inside by releasing people. And once you take the pressure off overcrowding in the facility, then you can do a lot of these other strategies more effectively. The other study comes from Texas, and it shows that prisons that are significantly under capacity have significantly lower infection rates. And so to me, this says the big levers here are about reducing prison and jail populations, and that means diverting from the front end and releasing at the back end, is very difficult to do. We don't have mechanisms. Our compassionate release laws are not written in a way that will allow medical vulnerability to be a significant criterion. And just to link these comments back to what Rashad and Topeka were saying, part of the problem here is the great dehumanization of people who are involved in the criminal justice system. In this moment where we need to let people out, people are not being viewed as sick. They're not being viewed as patients. They're not being viewed as medically vulnerable. They're still dehumanized and still shrouded in the stigma of criminality. So I think the COVID crisis in prisons and jails is very much related to the kinds of challenges that Rashad and Topeka were talking about.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. I think it is fascinating to see. It is very difficult. One of the issues that have come up in our own reporting has been the question of people using solitary confinement as a way of quarantine. So that, people trying to cope on some level are also putting people in a very punitive and psychologically and physically challenging situations. So there are a lot of issues in trying to cope with COVID behind bars. Let me turn to Rashad, since we talked about elections and the importance of elections. And Topeka made the important point that it's not just a federal election that's important, it's state and local elections. And I think that many times we see that criminal justice is, as LB pointed out, massively accountable and changeable at the local and state level. So how could you recommend in your view, that state and local prosecutors could be partners in this question of declining to prosecute? Or how could constituents hold prosecutors or elected officials, DAs, to account?
Well, I mean, without the sort of shameless plug, they can join our efforts at winningjustice.org. Winningjustice.org is the only national searchable database of the nearly 2,400 local prosecutors around the country. It's a database that we sort of update and keep focused with member energy. And so local member volunteers help us both keep the site populated, but on that, we've worked with movement partners, from racial justice organizations, policy organizations, legal organizations, and academics to develop 6 clear demands for prosecutors that are focused on decarceration and police accountability, and really working around the country at both holding prosecutors accountable and bringing sort of grassroots energy as well as policy expertise to the table to push for the type of practice changes that we know will reduce mass incarceration. Combining those practice changes with a real vision and a real deep understanding that prosecutors have way too much power, and that this is simply not about getting good prosecutors in office, which we want to do, but it's recognizing that the system at its core is flawed. And so we have to work on those dual tracks. And so around the country, we've been working with prosecutors in local places, doing work around co-governance, where we bring community officials, community leaders, and community activists in partnership with local leaders of the prosecutor's office to work on the type of changes that are necessary, working with policy experts who then go inside of those offices, but oftentimes really putting that outside pressure necessary. So winningjustice.org. Also, there's a lot of educational material on prosecutors, the role of prosecutors, and the sort of importance of focusing on these folks, which are oftentimes the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system, and bringing sort of the energy necessary to get to real change.
Thanks, Rashad. Yeah, as Bruce pointed out also, in fact, a lot of the reason that we've seen some decline in the prison and jail population has been that COVID has shut down courts, so that a lot of cases just haven't been brought, so that people therefore are not sent to prisons and jails at the same rate. So it's very important to note that lever of power. I want to turn to Topeka for a minute. When you specifically look at attempting to reduce the population of women who are incarcerated, I know, for example, and you alluded to this, that so many women end up taking the fall for boyfriends or others who are involved in the drug trade, and they end up getting very, very harsh sentences for being involved in some way, often through a man in their lives. But what policies would you look at to try to decrease the rate of locking up of women in jails and prisons?
Right. Well, first, I would look at what's happening now. Before we decrease the rate of going in, I want to get some of the sisters home who've been in there, who have served over 20, 30 years. If you look at the federal system, look at possibly reinstating federal parole so that people have an opportunity to come home. That happened before there were the sentencing guidelines. Some of the laws that have been enacted make them retroactive. So people who have been in prison for decades have an ability to actually get some relief from these new laws that passed to send them home. But then when I look at women specifically, there's some primary caretakers legislation that was passed in California, which was pre-plea. So a woman having maybe it being her first time engaged in the justice system, and then having an opportunity to do programming and get the resources that she needs if she has any children that are under, I believe it's 24 years of age and still in school, that she can go through a secondary and alternative to incarceration program, which then once she's completed successfully, she gets no record, no charge, and it's gone away. So that's another way, again, across the board, when you look at crimes across the states, whether it's probation and parole, right? Instead of putting people in prison, and they're putting people on a system of probation or parole. Probation specifically was supposed to be put in lieu of a sentence of incarceration, but we're now seeing where it is in addition to. So opposed to sending people to prison, we can do probation, have better systems where communities are actually working with other people like social workers, community resources, reentry programs, so that women have the things that they need. I would also think that we can look at housing laws. That's not being looked at much because it's federal, from my understanding. There's stipulations in housing courts, whether it be in the city or state level. We've been doing some research on that. With no safe, affordable housing, that keeps people vulnerable. And then they end up going and living through this lifestyle, or potentially even getting engaged in relationships because they have nowhere to live. That then lands them on this trajectory that lands to prison. Lastly, New York recently passed, because of years of advocacy for women who've actually been incarcerated, the DVSJA legislation for domestic violence survivors, women who actually were being harmed and actually went to prison because they protected themselves. How do we get some of those cases back in court? But even before women go to prison, how are we then looking at the issues and the things that they faced prior to even being in prison, or having to protect themselves and their children, that will prevent them from going to prison, and getting the resources, mental health treatment, and other things that they need to be able to sustain themselves and their children and their community.
Thanks so much, Topeka. We have one last question for LB, who's an expert on the privatization of the justice system. And we've talked a lot about people who profit from the current situation. Can you give us a little insight into that in our quick remaining time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Rashad sort of touched on the money that is taken out of communities and is really being stolen from communities. And it's a really important point. The prison industrial complex is vast, far greater than, the corporations that profit from managing and owning these prisons. They're really entrenched in sustaining and perpetuating mass incarceration. And when I say mass incarceration, I really mean the 7 million people under correctional supervision, and the thousands of people who are in our immigration detention system, and those people who are walking around with ankle monitors, who are in our immigration system as well. And really what we've seen is that the private industries, the firms that make money off of this sort of punishment system in the United States, they didn't create mass incarceration, right? Mass incarceration was created because of our punitive, draconian policies. But they've certainly helped sustain and grow mass incarceration. And they've capitalized on this lucrative market of prisoners, of probationers, of parolees, of people who are incarcerated, who might need to email their family, who are paying commissary. When we talk about this web of complex economic incentives, from prison telephone charges to architectural fees to lobbyists to food services, and firms that manage these facilities, the corporate structure here runs deep. And the nation's prison industrial complex relies on a vast infrastructure of financial incentives that create significant hurdles to dismantling mass incarceration.
Great.
And
Thank
that's
you so
really
much.
important.
I really appreciate all the panelists' participation today. I'd like to thank Laura Arnold, Michael Waldman, Rashad Robinson, Topeka Sam, Bruce Western, and Lauren-Brooke Eisen. And we're grateful for the partnership of the NYU Bradimus Center and NYU Votes for collaborating on this program. Thanks all of you for being here with us. Take care and stay safe.